and they told the Dallas police and District Attorney Wade what to say, okay? And so that's something that needs to be considered. Now, about the eyewitnesses, you know that at least 54 people are on record as having testified either in the Warren Commission or in interviews, statements and stuff, that they saw and heard shots from the front of the limousine. Okay, so it's a lot more than just a couple of people. We're talking about probably half of the people that were in Dealey Plaza that day. Even people that were in the doorway, like Billy Lovelady and Bill Shelley, they went running to the railroad yards, where everybody else was going. Jean Hill, she ran up the stairs. She went chasing for a gunman, and so on. And Roger Craig, you mentioned Roger Craig. He's one of my heroes, because Roger Craig maintained, exactly what you were talking about. Both of you mentioned him. And Roger Craig the year before had been nominated and won an award for excellency, as a law enforcement officer. So then from 1 year to the next, his whole life, is appended, and he ends up, like you said, committing suicide, because that's something that I don't believe in either. Now, you mentioned Arnold Roland. I just want to mention about Arnold Roland. He was a high school student like both of you, and he was standing there with his wife. He married very, very young, and he was still in high school, and he was there with his wife Barbara. And even though Barbara was a little nearsighted, she could see, what Roland also saw, which were, people there in two people in the east, southeast, and also, like you say, on the other side, of the floor. And how did they go about dealing with him? Well, they did what you mentioned. They tried to discredit him. So he's another of the witnesses that they did try to discredit. And they even went to his high school, and checked out his high school records and everything, and they so that's how, this whole MO is starting to, and there's just too many coincidences, like you mentioned, Now, about the washing of the limo, you also have to add that they took John Connolly's clothes, and they sent him to the cleaners right away. They confiscated them, and that's it, and all this evidence is being destroyed, which I think is instrumental in building a case, because a lot of this stuff is, like both of you have mentioned, is not admissible. Period. If a prosecutor tries to bring this up, he's not gonna stand 30 seconds. A judge is just gonna throw it out. Okay. Now, just one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Larry, I had a question. If you concede that point there, wouldn't that also be a strong point to prove conspiracy? Because from the get-go, they knew that they never could build a legal case.
Of course. And just a little word of caution here. Sometimes you both go into conclusions that would not be allowed in a court of law. Like, you can't say a government's forged, or you can't say the government lied or the DPD lied. You have to present the facts and let the jury decide, based on what you were presenting them. Okay. Now, Madison, tremendous also, the thing about the driver's license I wanted to add, in Louisiana, it's known that the motor vehicle agency, they purged all of Lee Oswald's driver's license records. Okay. And there are witnesses that there are documents that show that these witnesses, testified to this, in interviews, and these are people that were never brought before the Warren Commission, obviously, because this would have shown, how all of this frame, occurred. And now this Bernie Hare, who saw Lee Oswald taken out the back alley. Well, if you've been to the Texas Theater, the alley is actually on the side. Okay, so this happened. When this happened, not only were other cops there waiting, but Bill Alexander, the assistant district attorney, was there. And there's another interesting point that you brought up, Madison, and I wanted to expand a little bit on that. And what you're doing in analyzing the movements of these Dallas Police Department officers is right on. It's spot on. Okay, and when you question why would Westbrook be there arresting Oswald? Well, he wasn't the only one who was there. Paul Bentley, who was prominently, shown in that photograph arresting Oswald, tussling with Oswald, into the car, outside the Texas Theater. He was the polygraph. He was head of the polygraph department. Okay, so what would he be doing? Doing what regular policemen should have been doing. So I think that's an incredibly important point that you bring up, Madison. Now, also these cops, like you said, they were all at the three most important events. Okay, yes, but you also have to. Now we know that Roscoe White was also he was at the search of the Payne's house. He was at the Tippit murder scene, and now we're starting to get a better idea, a better feel for what Roscoe White's involvement was in all this. And like I said, going after these, scrutinizing the movements of these police officers is a field right now that is pretty open. I don't know of anybody that's really tried to do this, and I would go on and research this further. I would encourage you to go ahead and do that, because there's not that much out there, right now. Now, to give you an example, Gus Rose, and I put this up on my blog a few months ago. Gus Rose was involved. If you go and research Randy Adams, he was framed for a murder right there in Dallas. Well, Gus Rose tried to frame him, and he tried in an interrogation. He actually tried to put a gun in his hands, so the fingerprints would be on the gun. Okay, so and also District Attorney Wade prosecuted him, and he knew he was innocent, and his conviction was overturned later on. But the same players were using the same MO as with Lee Oswald, and that's why I bring this up in my blog, because we're talking about the same players, and this Rose guy who helped frame Randy Adams. They wouldn't even allow him a phone call, okay, which is exactly what they did to Lee Oswald. So you see this whole thing sort of like they were used to. This was something that the Dallas Police Department had done before, obviously with Lee Oswald, and in light of all of these convictions by Wade that have been overturned recently, it's I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. Now. Another guy that was at all the events was Hugh Ainsworth, okay, and he was a reporter who is really we all know that he's agency connected, and he's been one of these reporters that have all from day one reported that Lee Oswald was a lone assassin, and he's been with Warren Commission and so on and so forth. So he's another one who was also at all these different events, during the weekend. Now, which you mentioned Hill, and and another thing that I just wanted to stress here when you do your research is documents. Okay, nothing beats documents. Okay, but you have to be careful with the documents that you study. A lot of these documents, for example, the Mexico City documents, have all been falsified. Okay, and so. Yes, it's important to look at documents and use them, but you have to know their source, and you have to study them properly in order to see how it ties into the case. And another thing you mentioned about the USSR, the Soviet Union. Well, they, not only the Soviet Union, but France, Germany, they all laughed at how naive the American public could be in accepting this. Okay, and the very first authors that published books about the assassination were in France and Germany. Joachim Jolsten, Leo Savage, all of these guys. And when in the US, nobody would even publish anything. Like I said before, Harold Weisberg had to self-publish. Well, these guys were in Europe, and they could publish whatever they wanted, and not have the repercussions, of the government, falling on, and the apparatus of the government falling upon them. So, that's right on, and all these governments, in the whole world, the only country that believed that Lee Oswald shot Kennedy was the people of the United States. Okay, now, that document that you showed about the CIA training Oswald, be careful with that, because I've done research on that, and the jury is still out as far as its authenticity. Okay, that's something that you got to be very careful with. And like I said, my final advice is always try to be factual and analytical, and you will get the truth out. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor.
Yeah, let me pull up. How we know Lee was framed. And by the way, I believe you have shown conclusively even that the Dallas Police Department was responsible for framing Lee Oswald. Now, we all know the official account, 3 shots from the 6th floor window, which has been falsified on multiple grounds. What's striking about the arrest report, I think, is that it's not tentative. It doesn't say he was arrested as a suspect. It states this man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy and police officer J.D. Tippit. He also shot and wounded Governor John Connally. Well, it's only 1:40. The assassination took place at 12:30. They've conducted no investigation, and yet you have this definitive assertion that this man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy. I mean, the document itself is, as it were, self-discrediting because it shows it can't possibly be the case. We now know, of course, that the famous photograph taken by James Ike Alchins, AP photographer, not only shows the bullet hole in the windshield where JFK's left ear would be if his left ear were visible, a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, but in the background just above in this region here, a figure extending out who, as many have widely believed to have been Lee Oswald, a figure standing beside him with his hands raised, has had his face blacked out, but notice how the shoulder of the figure leaning out is missing, as though he had a towel over it. And when we look more closely, we find there's a figure known as a black tie man, both in front of and behind him at the same time, which is an optical impossibility. Notice the figure with his hands raised has had his face blacked out, that his shirt has been obfuscated by a massive addition of white material, but that he's wearing a short sleeve shirt, which makes it, to me, incredible that anyone would believe that the photograph has never been altered, because these features make it what I would suggest is conclusive proof of alteration. We know that Lee told Fritz during his interview that he was out with Bill Shelley in front, which means that we have to investigate his alibi, since obviously that's the most important of all the information he gave to Fritz. When he was arrested, he bore a striking resemblance to the figure in the doorway in terms of the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the T-shirt, where the shirt was a very richly textured long sleeve shirt that had been considerably worn. Look at the lower part that was splayed open to the middle. It was so clear that Oswald resembled the man in the doorway that the Dallas Police Department had him remove his outer shirt before they took his mug shot. Notice a striking contrast, which I believe represents consciousness of guilt. They were working to frame him. They didn't want him to be exonerated. Richard Hook has done brilliant work comparing the features of the shirt of the man in the doorway with features on the shirt of Lee Oswald when he was arrested. This is one of his most preliminary studies. He has found dozens and dozens of similarities that really leave no doubt about it. Here we have a comparison of the Lee Oswald with a man in Mexico City who was photographed, eventually leading J. Edgar Hoover to issue a memorandum to his FBI agents in charge stating that someone was in Mexico City impersonating Lee Oswald. Larry Rivera has found documents in relation to Mexico City that it appears were never intended to be released, where you can see principals in the position to frame Lee talking about how they were going to do it, which reinforces our conclusion that Lee was, in fact, never in Mexico City. Here we have from a Lone Nutter website, John McAdams. He attempts to cast attention on the man, a face that's obfuscated in your shadow, away from the doorway man, but clearly the emphasis is on the checkered shirt, because there was a figure, the second from the right, standing there, to whom I refer as Gorilla Man because of his profile, clearly much heavier, much larger than Lee, much larger than the man in the doorway, who had a red and black checkered shirt that was buttoned up to the neck, which they the fallback position about the identity of doorman, therefore, was this man in the checkered shirt, which it's then claimed was Billy Lovelady, where you had Robert Groden taking a series of photographs on the right of Billy Lovelady purportedly wearing the same shirt. But if you look at the left, you can see it's obviously not, because the shirt on Gorilla Man had a pocket. The shirt on Billy Lovelady, the red and black checkered shirt, has no pocket. Here we have Billy going to the FBI on the 29th of February, 1964, wearing the shirt that he wore at the time. It was a red and white vertically striped shirt. It was a short sleeve shirt. It looked nothing like the shirt on Doorman. The FBI nevertheless sent a memorandum back to J. Edgar Hoover, identifying him as the man in the doorway. Notice the underlined sentence at the first end of the first full paragraph. He stated he was wearing a red and white vertically striped shirt and blue jeans during the time he was present in the doorway observing the shooting. Now, Larry has done absolutely sensational work with overlays, where you can take photographs that might seemingly appear to be of two different persons to determine if they're the same, just as the two top photographs look as though they might be different persons, but they turn out, of course, to be one and the same Marilyn Monroe. He did this, found suitable photographs to use to impose over the figures in the doorway, and found that, as you can see here, the man in the doorway not only has the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, the t-shirt that Lee Oswald was wearing, but he has the same facial features. When you compare Lee on the left with Billy on the right, you see, while it fits Lee hand in glove, it does not fit Billy. The chin is wrong, the ears are wrong, the nose is wrong. Clearly, the man in the doorway extending out is Lee Oswald rather than Billy Lovelady. Larry has also been able to establish, however, that the man holding his hands, which fits Billy's own description of himself as being 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds lighter, and of course, the testimony he gave to the FBI on the 29th of February, 1964, that he was wearing a red and white vertically striped t-shirt. Even the facial features fit Billy. So that it looks from Richard Hook's reconstruction that they took elements internal to the original photograph to preserve the texture and other features in order to create the composite that we see in the Altons we have been subjecting to study. But that if you put it together properly, what you would have when you fill in the shirt, when you remove the black tie man from over the shoulder of Doorman, it would have looked as we see on the right. In fact, here is another reconstruction Larry has done using Blender, in which you see a reconstruction of the image in the doorway. And you can tell, therefore, why they had to obfuscate the photograph and black it out. Here's yet another. I cannot say enough in complimenting Larry for his brilliant work in confirming the conclusion we'd already established based upon the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt, to wit, that the man in the doorway, known as Doorman, was Lee Harvey Oswald, which not only means he cannot have been the lone demented gunman, but that he cannot have been one of the shooters. In terms of framing Lee, the life in the backyard photographs, Here we have the famous photograph that appeared on the cover of Life magazine that was intended to implicate him as having the motive and the means. The public already knew he had the opportunity by being at the book depository as an employee. So here you have him holding the Mannlicher Carcano, a pistol belt with a revolver with which he is alleged to have shot Officer J.D. Tippit, holding two communist newspapers, The Worker and The Militant, thereby combining means and motive. He was a communist. They, of course, suppress information such as you have reported during your very fine presentations that Lee, in fact, admired JFK. He bore him no malice. I return again to this shocking arrest record, which states in a definitive fashion, having no investigation whatsoever taken place, that he was guilty not only of the assassination of JFK and the wounding of Governor Connolly, but of Tippit. Here we have one of the photographs of Lee describing the arrest as having been about 80 minutes, which would have made it actually at 150 instead of 140. Which
I'm sorry, that's Paul Bentley. That's with the cigar in his mouth, and you know that as a result of that fracas, he twisted an ankle, and then he had to put the ankle in a cast. You know, that same day. Go ahead,
Larry. I previously observed that if it was 80 minutes after, then it was 150, and the arrest record at 140 was therefore written even in advance of the arrest. Can you clarify which time is correct, 140 or 150 for the arrest at the Texas Theater? Well, here it's taking place where they're moving him out, but as you have so ably reported, there was another figure coming out in the alley in the background. This shows how far out of his way Lee would have had to go to have shot Tippit. It's really preposterous. Aquila Clemens seems to have been the key witness, reporting two men shot Tippit. Neither of them looked like Oswald. If he had come from his rooming house, he would have gone straight up Crawford onto Jefferson, taken a right to the Texas Theater. But as we will now see, there's reason to believe that, in fact, he actually arrived at the theater via the Rambler. Here we have a reconstruction of the shooting from the Search for Lee Harvey Oswald by Robert Groden, that Tippit approaches a pedestrian. He spoke to the pedestrian through the window. The assassin threw his gun and fired 3 times, hitting him in the torso, and then walked up and shot him an additional time in the right temple. Here's Aquila Clemens testifying about having seen 2 men, neither of whom looked like Lee Oswald. Here we have the fascinating report from Robert Groden that appears to be accurate, that the shell casings found at the scene initially had been ejected from automatics. They're technically, of course, semi-automatics. Automatics, you depress a trigger and it continues firing automatically. With a semi-automatic, it simply automatically reloads each time you pull the trigger. But the automatic shell casing, if you compare the two on the left, is the shorter round. Oswald had a revolver. His shell casing would have been longer. So there were 4 automatic shell casings, 2 Western and 2 Remington Ramna, 2 different makes, which is further indication of 2 shooters. Here we have a report about a link between the Tippit murder and the Texas Theater by a fellow named Tom Lyons, where he reports in Crossfile where Jim Mars discussed a tape interview with Butch Burroughs, where someone had come into the theater shortly after 1. Look at the second paragraph, and that Burroughs actually had sold him popcorn. We find more about that when we do research. How Burroughs had told Nigel that Turner, the producer of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, that Oswald entered the theater between 1 and 1:07, and it would have therefore have been impossible for him to have been in 2 places at the same time. When Tippit was killed around 1:10, here is fascinating about Stephen Westberg and Pete Engwald looking at the Tippit case from a different angle. Here they're suggesting, Tippit was involved, that he went, to the area, but was also being set up financially. and that someone got out of the theory here they're presenting, which I believe is correct. Oswald got out of the Nash Ranger at the Texas Theater, a theater owned by Howard Hughes. Even Robert Mayhew had been a major CIA operator, was Hughes' chief of security. He bought a ticket, bought popcorn. It would appear, therefore, that the individual who went to the rooming house, took the jacket, was not, in fact, Lee, but someone who looked very much like Lee. We know the backyard photograph was fake now. We have the chin, the wrong chin. We have the insert line between the lower lip and the chin. Jack White realized that the newspapers provide an internal yardstick, and you can determine the height of the individual thereby. Showed the stand-in was either only 5'6", or the image of the newspapers had been introduced too large, which turns out to be the case. We know about Lee. We know no two handheld snapshots should match, and yet these match with regard to the face, exactly indicating that what he told Fritz, to wit, that it was his face pasted on someone else's body, and that with time he'd be able to prove it. Here is an observation from Robert Blakey, who headed the House Select Committee investigation. If the backyard photographs are invalid, how they were produced poses far-reaching questions in the area of conspiracy. For the events, a degree of technical sophistication that would almost necessarily raise the possibility that someone conspired not only to kill the president, but to make Oswald a patsy. And of course, we've been able to show that they were indeed fabrications. In fact, Larry has observed that while Jim Marzenide concluded that Roscoe White had been the stand-in because he had the blocked chin, the same approximate height, weight, and build, though we'll find Roscoe's actually a huskier guy than Lee. He had this odd lump on his wrist from a bone that healed right. Larry has observed that Roscoe actually knew a lot about photography. I would say his surmise that Roscoe probably produced the photographs themselves is correct. This was a ghost image found in the desk of a Dallas detective, and of course we know now Larry has found an image of Roscoe that enables us to superimpose and see that he is the stand-in. This is confirmation of his serving as the stand-in for Lee. Where Larry's more recent work, by the way, shows that if you juxtapose Lee Oswald's own image against the image of the figure in the backdoor photographs, Lee is slighter than the back figure in those photographs, which of course is consistent with Roscoe, who is more robust, having created them. Here's yet another. Larry again has done completely brilliant work here to confirm conclusions, to solidify and strengthen the conclusions that